All right. Hey, good morning, everyone. It's good to see all of you. I don't know if you're anything like me, but I really like to control my life. Anyone else like that? Great confession for the morning. Yeah, I like to control my life. I like to think that through my careful planning, through all my wise decisions, through all of the details, that I'll just successfully navigate myself and my family through all the ups and downs of life. And that sounds really nice until you grow up, until you realize that, wow, life doesn't work that way. Hey, Brett Smith, will you close those doors so I don't see everyone out there? That'd be awesome. Super distracting. I love it though. And it didn't take me long to realize that you can't control life. You can't control the things that happen to you. In fact, it's actually been through the circumstances beyond my control that I actually have more than often redirected my life and not my own careful planning, if I admit it. And some of those circumstances have been great. Some of those circumstances have been good, but many of those have been painful. Many of those have been really hard to deal with. And most of our lives are actually spent dealing with people and situations that are totally beyond our control. And some of those events are really small and insignificant. Some of those events we hardly even notice or even think about. But other times, those events are massive, life-altering events. And oftentimes, again, if you've lived life long enough, those circumstances seem totally unfair. Have you ever said, God, why has this happened to me? Yeah, maybe, you worked your tail off in high school and you got great grades, straight A's. You had all the extracurricular activities. And you didn't get into any of the top high schools on your list. That is the story for thousands of California high school kids. Or maybe you put in hard time and work at your job. You've been a team player. You've been super supportive of your boss, even though you don't like her. And the promotion went to someone else. Or maybe, you eat clean. You work out regularly. My buddy gave me a shot of elderberry apple cider vinegar this morning, just for fun. But then those test results came back with a very scary diagnosis. Or maybe you've been faithful, you've been good to your spouse, but now you find yourself dealing with a betrayal that has cut out your heart, leaving you totally in despair. Life is unfair. And it doesn't matter if you're a Christian or a non-Christian, right? Life is unfair. See, Christians, we believe that we actually live in a broken and fallen world, a place where actually evil is often reigning and feels like it's winning most of the time, and we do hurtful things to others. Hurtful things are done to us. That's how life is. But some of you, if you don't have a faith background, you actually believe that life is unfair because of just fate or bad luck. That's just the way it is. Suck it up, buttercup, and move on. But what happens is when life comes unraveled at the seams, especially for Christians, a lot of times we're left wondering, God, where are you in the pain and the confusion and the disappointments of it all? Because if you're good, why is this happening to me? If you love me, why is this happening to me? And there have been so many times in my life where God has felt near to me in those times of pain and disappointment and suffering. But also many times when I was like, God, where are you? And so what we're going to learn today, and actually what we're going to relearn and what we're going to just continue to remember throughout our entire lives, is this line that I'll repeat all day. Even when life is unfair, God is still working. Even when life is unfair, you can trust and know that God is still working. And so last week, we began the study on a book called Esther. To be honest with you, I've never studied the book, so I'm like blown away at what's in there. I know the book, of course, right? I saw the VeggieTales deal, and I get it. But, Esther is a young Jewish woman living in exile in the Persian Empire. She's an orphan. She's being raised by her older cousin, a man by the name of Mordecai. That's a great name for a dog. They're living in the city of Susa. Esther was beautiful in form, beautiful in face, so much so that she won the Miss Universe pageant of the Persian Empire. King Xerxes made her the queen of Persia. She's moved into the palace, living her new life of luxury and privilege. And yet, if you look, you can start to see what I would call the storm clouds of life's unfairness are starting to form. Because suddenly we meet the antagonist of the story, Haman. Dun, 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 dun. Now, before we get to him, let's look at what happens to Mordecai. Look with me. If you have a Bible, go ahead and turn to Esther chapter 2. Esther chapter 2, and I'm going to start looking and reading in verse 21. Esther chapter 2, starting in verse 21. We read that during the time Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's officers who guarded the doorway, became angry and conspired to assassinate King Xerxes. But Mordecai found out about the plot and told Queen Esther, who in turn reported it to the king, giving credit to Mordecai. And the report was investigated and found to be true. The two officials were invited to tea, they were impaled on poles. We all said, ouch, that's a terrible way to go out. All this was recorded in the book of the annals in the presence of the king. And so Mordecai is at the king's gate. He was probably, most scholars believe that, Queen Esther hooked him up with a job, official position in the royal court, and he's doing his job, whatever he did at the king's gate. And Mordecai just so happens to be sitting at the gate at the right time. Just so happens. Now remember, if you were with us last week, I encouraged you to pay attention as we study the book of Esther, as we look in our own lives, to pay attention to the just so happens, to pay attention to the coincidences, to the good luck that we have when you're in the right place and at the right time, because often it's God's hidden hand of providence at work. And so on this day, and unlike, just like most normal days, this day is a little different. Mordecai overhears two of the king's guards planning how they're going to take out the king. All right, man, this is what we're going to do. We're going to do this and that. And Mordecai's, listen, now we're not told why they were angry enough to plot an assassination, but they certainly had the proximity to carry it out. If you watch any TV, you see all the stories of kings and queens, right? This happens all the time, right? And so Mordecai immediately texts Queen Esther, who tells the king. She gives all the credit to Mordecai, and the king does what kings do, right? Impales these two officials on poles. Let's keep reading. Esther chapter 3, verse 1, it says, after these events, King Xerxes honored Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, elevating him and giving him a seat of honor higher than that of all the other nobles. And you read this and you're suddenly going, oh, wait, what? Wait, excuse me? Wait. Why is Haman honored and not Mordecai? Now, you should know that it was very typical for a king to immediately honor anyone that showed that kind of loyalty, that kind of respect, the kind that Mordecai displayed. I mean, Mordecai essentially saved the king's life. And so it's shocking to read that Haman, not Mordecai, was honored. This is unfair. This is an injustice. This is life at its unfairness, at its peak. But when life seems unfair, sometimes, not all the time, but I would say most oftentimes, God has a greater purpose in the delays and in the denials that we all experience. See, here's the reality, and we'll see this next week. If Mordecai was honored in that moment, at that exact time, instead of Haman, he would not have been in a position to outwit Haman's evil plan later. And we'll look at that in the weeks to come. But for us, could it be in the confusion, in the waiting for results, in the delays, and even in the denials of life, could it be God's way of working through the good and even the bad for his purposes and his timing? Can we as the people of God trust in him and his plans? Because again, even when life seems unfair, God is always working. But if your life is like Mordecai's or like mine, things often go from bad to worse. And that's exactly what happens. Look with me now at verse 2. All the royal officials at the king's gate knelt down and paid honor to Haman, for the king had commanded this concerning him, but Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honor. That's interesting. Then the royal officials at the king's gate asked Mordecai, yo, man, why do you disobey the king's command, homie? Day after day, they spoke to him, and he refused to comply. Therefore, they told Haman about it to see whether Mordecai's behavior would be tolerated, for he had told them that he was a Jew. When Haman saw that Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honor, he was enraged. Yet, having learned that who Mordecai's people were, he scorned the idea of killing only Mordecai. Instead, Haman looked for a way to destroy all Mordecai's people, the Jews, throughout the whole kingdom of Xerxes. In the 12th year of King Xerxes, in the first month, the month of Nisan, the pure, that is the lot, was cast in the presence of Haman to select a day and month, and the lot fell on the 12th month, the month of Adar. Okay, what's going on here? So at this point, by the way, scripture goes really quickly. It's been about 5 years had passed since the assassination attempt on the king. So that's a lot of time. And so King Xerxes actually is now back historically. We know this from history and other books, extra biblical books. He's actually back in Susa from the humiliating loss to the Greeks. Remember when he threw that big party to get all his kings and nobles together and princes to fight the Greeks? Well, they lost. And so his power and his wealth have been depleted. He's not in a good emotional or mental state. He's not doing well. So it's no wonder he's letting Haman do whatever he wants. Now, there's a few things, though, we learn about Haman that kind of helps us to understand, like, why would Mordecai not pay him any respect? And what's the big deal, Mordecai? Just bow down and, and go on with your life. Don't you want to live? But the author kind of subtly throws a few things in there that most of us will miss. The first thing he says that Haman was an Agagite. No, that is not a type of rock. Doesn't it sound like it? And so the original readers of the book would have clearly picked up on his name and the age-old conflict between Israel and all the nations that tried to destroy her. So, quick history lesson, a long, long time ago, King Saul was told by the prophet Samuel to kill all the Amalekites because they attacked Israel years earlier. But Saul disobeyed. He has spared not only some of the Amalekites, but the Amalekites' king, King Agag. Another terrible name. That'd be a dog name too. Hey, Agag, get over here. And so the Agagites were the descendants of the Amalekites, and they hated the Jews for years. And the early readers would have all understood this. And so the author of Esther wants us to see, wants us to know, wants us to feel that Haman was not just an awful person, but he was the number one enemy of the Jews. Okay? Secondly, the king had to command his officials to pay Haman honor. Did you notice that? Like, honestly, like, what kind of man was this guy when the king says, hey, I know none of us like him, but pay him respect and honor. Bow down to him, you guys. Oh, okay. Right? Because Haman was, I don't know, I would call him a brown-nosing, evil, rascal, terrible person. There are people like that, believe it or not, right? Right? I mean, you had to force people to bow down to him. And Mordecai wasn't having that. Haman also was clearly anti-Semitic, right? The text does not say that explicitly, but is clearly implied. Haman was told that Mordecai was a Jew. He refused to bow down to him. This enraged Haman. He came up with this plan to not only kill Mordecai, but all the Jews. And so that tells me there was clearly hostility and tension in the royal court between Jews and Persians. And I think this was, again, one of the reasons why Mordecai told Esther not to tell anyone her identity and her nationality. And then finally, if I'm being real, if I know men and the human heart, I think this was just personal for Mordecai. I don't know if he's a normal man, I think, or even a woman. I think he resented the fact that Haman was promoted instead of him. I think Mordecai refused to bow down to this pagan person, this enemy, because he just didn't respect him. And then also religiously as a Jew, Jewish people believe that you should only bow down to God. And so he's like, I'm not going to bow down to this guy. Now, whatever the reasons for Mordecai not bowing down, man, Haman was infuriated. Let's keep reading. This is a longer passage. I'll get through it, but look with me at verse 8 now. Then Haman said to King Xerxes, King, there's a certain people, don't worry about their names, dispersed among the peoples in the provinces of your kingdom. They keep themselves separate. Their customs are different from those of all the other people. They do not obey the king's laws. It's actually not in the king's best interest to tolerate them. So, hey, you know what? I'm going to do you a favor, king. If it pleases you, you know what? Why don't you write up a little decree and let's destroy them. And a matter of fact, king, I'll give you 10,000 talents of silver to the king's administrators for the royal treasury. So this will be good for all of us. And so the king took off his signet ring from his finger and he gave it to Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews. And the king said, hey, keep the money and do with the people as you please, whoever they are. And then on the 13th day of the first month, the royal secretaries were summoned. They wrote out the script in each province and in the language of each people, all of Haman's orders to the king's satraps, the governors of the various provinces, and the nobles of the various peoples. These were written in the name of King Xerxes himself and sealed it with a kiss. No, sealed it with his own ring. And dispatches were sent out all over the king's provinces in the order to destroy, kill, and annihilate all the Jews, young and old, women and children, on a single day, the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar, and plunder their goods. And a copy of the text of the edict was issued as law in every province and made known to the people of every nationality so they would be ready for that day. And the couriers went out, spurred on by the king's command, and the edict was issued in the citadel of Susa. The king and Haman sat down to drink, but the city of Susa was bewildered. Wow. And so what we see here is Haman was a conniving politician, man. He was a master manipulator. He does actually several things to win the king's request. First, he appeals to the king's need to replenish his treasury. He just had faced a humiliating defeat to this disastrous war in Greece. Haman promises 10,000 talents of silver. What is that? That is a lot of money. That is 375 tons of money, to be exact, of silver. And so the majority of silver would actually come from the annihilation of the Jews. Second, Haman, as most often happens, doesn't tell the king the whole truth. It's kind of like lie, a little bit of truth, lie, right? Kind of like a sandwich. He doesn't tell them the actual name of the group he wants to destroy. He says, there's just some certain people. He doesn't tell them why or how these people keep themselves separate. He didn't tell them that the Jews actually paid their taxes, that they actually obeyed the law and lived peacefully within the Persian Empire. He didn't tell them about their religion and why they refused to eat certain foods they considered unclean, or why they practiced their own religion. He just kind of brushes under the rug all of that. And so the king was foolishly allowing Haman to use his royal power to Haman's evil end. The king blows me away, even refuses the money. This tells me that he was really depressed after the defeat of the Greeks. And then Haman does something very interesting. And at that time, Haman basically casts lots. He rolls the dice. The lots are called pur or purim, plural. Actually, if you see on the screen here, archaeologists have unearthed similar dice. Do those look familiar to your modern day dice? That's where we got them from. So these are not the exact ones that Haman rolled. I mean, maybe they were, but... And so he casts these lots to ask the gods to choose a date to destroy all the Jews. And what's so interesting is Haman rolled the dice in the first month of Nisan, which was ironically the same month that the Jews celebrate Passover. And then the lot fell just so happened on the 12th month of Adar. The decree is sent out all over the kingdom, to the horror of not only the Jewish people, but all the people in the empire. If you look at the text, it says the whole city was like bewildered. They were like, what is going on here? And if you think about it, the Jewish people at this time had to wait 11 months before the day that they would be slaughtered. Can you imagine 11 months of waiting for their demise? I mean, I can't even imagine that kind of stress. And so the chapter then ends with with the king and Haman kind of sitting by the pool, drinking cocktails while the whole city is confused and angry and sad, right? If you want to know how evil these men were, just look right there, right? Oh, we can't wait for the annihilation. I need another olive in my martini, right? And the truth is, and we know this from history, that forces are always at work wanting nothing more to destroy God's people and God's promises. I actually have always said that the fact that the Jewish people have survived until today, I think, is one of the greatest testimonies to God's protection and power. And here in Esther, we are reminded that no one and nothing, not even an evil empire, not even an evil prime minister named Haman, not even anyone will ever stop or frustrate God's people and God's plan, because, man, even when life is unfair, which it is, God is always working. And let's look at this story again. Let's go back for a second here. Let's look at Esther for a quick second, and we'll see much more about her in the weeks to come. But think about it from her perspective. She's taken from her home, brought into the king's court to essentially be sexually used. What plans did she have for her life? What kind of family does she want to raise? We'll never know. We're never told. And what about Mordecai? He was totally embarrassed by not receiving a reward that he should have received. He put his life at risk, right, to save the king, and yet another guy, a guy that he despised, got the promotion and got actually more power that was then used against him and the entire Jewish people. Life is unfair, and it's really frustrating when our best laid out plans don't work, when our good deeds or our hard work go unnoticed, when our prayers seem not to be answered. It's actually really frustrating when wicked people prosper instead of us. But Esther's story, Mordecai's story will remind us over and over again that, gosh, even when life is unfair, we can trust that God is still working, because even through those disappointments of life, we can actually live with patience and grace as we place our trust in a God who is always working behind the scenes. See, whether you like it or not, as followers of Jesus, we walk by faith and not sight. We put our trust in a God who can even use the awful things that happen to us for his good. In fact, one of my all-time favorite stories of the entire Bible is a man named Joseph, who lived a long time ago in the Old Testament book of Genesis. His brothers who sold him into slavery, who then he found himself in prison, who was misused and abused. At the end of his life, he tells his brother, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good." See, even Jesus reminded his disciples of the persecution and the struggles that were coming their way. Even Jesus told the disciples, life will be unfair. And Jesus said, "I've told you these things so that in me you may have peace. Because in this world you will have trouble, but take heart, I have overcome the world." And so, Esther's story, Mordecai's story, hits home in so many ways for me personally. As I look back on my life, there were so many times where I was like, that's unfair. Growing up poor, without a father around, with a drug-addicted mother, I didn't have a childhood. That's unfair. Being at the mercy of the welfare system, rent control and handouts was unfair. It was embarrassing when my mom gave me food stamps to use at the grocery store. Man, my family hit rock bottom once when my mom's boyfriend overdosed and died. She went into a deep depression. She couldn't work. And so we were evicted from our apartment in Marin County, forced to live in a homeless shelter for families. Thank you, Gigi. But at the time, I think I was 10. Meanwhile, I was playing all-star baseball and no one had any idea what was going on in my life. It's unfair. But as I look back on my life, I realize that at a young age, I had to hustle and work to put food on our table. And that work ethic still drives me today, for better or worse. I have a deep compassion and sympathy for people, especially kids growing up in poverty. And that comes out in some of our ministry initiatives. And as I look back on my life, I can see how God was there. In those dark moments. See, I prayed to God long before I had any relationship with him, because God was working in my life. God protected me from physical and sexual abuse, which was miraculous because God was working. God brought teachers and coaches and neighbors and people in my life at key moments because God was working. And so when I finally heard the gospel, man, I was wide open. And so what seems unfair in your life? Where are you tempted to doubt God's goodness and provision for you? I would encourage you, write them down. Spend some time this week looking back over your life and spend some time looking for all those ways that God protected you and provided for you, and use those hard, unfair things to form Jesus in you. Man, if life seems unfair right now, welcome. But write that down too. Write down all your frustrations, all those pain points, and then bring him to Jesus. Bring him all those unfair things happening now and pray that God would use them for his glory and your good, because that is who God is. Because when life is unfair, God is always working. And so we're going to transition to a time of communion, and I'm going to invite the ushers to come up. They can start passing out the elements. And what's so ironic is that the date that was set for the Jewish massacre, the date for the casted lot of the massacre was actually the day before the slaying of the Passover lamb. And if you don't know your Jewish history, that's okay, your Old Testament. The Passover was a celebration of God's rescuing his people from the angel of death who passed over and spared all the firstborn children of Israel. And on that day, the Israelites would actually slaughter a lamb, and then they would wipe the blood on the doorposts of their home. And the Passover was a yearly reminder of how God saved his people from slavery in Egypt. And so here in the book of Esther, the people of God are facing another annihilation again. And the question and the tension that we feel in Esther is this tension. See, we know how the story ends. They didn't know how the story ended. Would God save his people from the brutal plans of Haman? And the answer is clear. Yes, God would. Now, fast forward to the New Testament, to the life and ministry of Jesus Christ. Would God save his people from sin, from Satan, from death? Yes, God would triumph in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. So all that the Passover symbolized was fulfilled in Jesus, the perfect Passover lamb. And so here's the deal. When the angel of death comes for you, he'll see the blood of Jesus on you and he'll pass over you. And so as Jesus' enemies nailed him to a cross, as Satan thought he got the best of him, as all the disciples ran away and struggled with the unfairness of life, God was working out his rescue plan of redemption. Because when life is unfair, God is always working. And so if you can take out the bread off the little top there at home, if you can get crackers and juice, on the night that Jesus was betrayed, on a night where it was unfair for Jesus, he got up and he took bread and he thanked God the Father for the bread and he broke it. And he said, "This is my body broken for you. Let's eat together." And then on that same night, he thanked God for the cup of the new covenant. And he said, "This is the cup of the new covenant in my blood. For as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you are proclaiming the Lord's death until he comes again." Let's drink together, church. And I'm going to pray, but we're just going to take some quiet moments of reflection. I don't know, maybe 30 seconds. And I just want you to just sit with God. Wrestle with him if you need to. Pray to him about how life's been unfair in your life. Lay it all out to him. And then we'll sing. Father in heaven, we thank you for who you are. We thank you that in the ups and downs, in the good and the bad, that we can trust your sovereign hidden hand. We can trust that you are working because you are a good God who loves your people so much. In Jesus' name we pray.